The Haymarket Riot was a Chicago-based event that eventually resulted in improved workers' rights across the world. In 1886, upwards of 20,000 men were on strike daily. The strikes began because the workers were sick of working 10 or more hours a day, and they wanted to have an 8-hour workday. They also wanted fair wages. The companies obviously did not want these changes. Following a strike at McCormick Reaper Works in Chicago where police killed several strikers, labor organizers called for a meeting and a rally on the next day to be held in Haymarket Square in Chicago. A bloody conflict ensued and, in the end, police and civilians were dead. Despite a lack of evidence, 8 anarchists who were at the forefront of the labor movement were arrested and convicted of conspiracy. 4 of the men were hanged and a 5th committed suicide in prison before the last 3 were eventually pardoned. The resulting imprisonment and death of these innocent men only fed the resolve of the workers, and factories slowly switched to the 8-hour workday where people could return home from meals, see the daylight, and care for their children.
Although the conflict in itself was a tragedy, the Haymarket Riot paved the way for a new era of life. At the time, the predominantly male workforce was the beneficiary of the 8-hour workday. However, women held pivotal roles in the strikes, riots, and trials that led to these important compromises. While much has been written about the men involved in the labor movement and Haymarket Riot, less is commonly known about the women. 3 women were especially influential in the Haymarket Riot and its aftermath: Lucy Parsons, Lizzie Swank Holmes, and Sarah Ames. These women came together as labor organizers with the International Working People's Association and the International Ladies' Garment Workers Union. Lucy Parsons was arguably the most influential woman in the Haymarket Riot and its aftermath. Born in Texas with African American, Native American, and Mexican ancestry, she often used the surname Gonzalez and denied her African American heritage to sidestep racial tensions as much as she could. She met her husband, Albert Parsons, in Texas, but they soon moved to Chicago because of fear of the Ku Klux Klan. Once they reached Chicago, Albert worked as a printer and Lucy opened a dress shop with her friend Lizzie Swank. During this time, they all became involved with the growing labor movement with demands for better wages and work hours. Lucy began to write for many radical publications. Her pieces appeared in The Socialist and The Alarm, an anarchist weekly published by the International Working People's Association, the IWPA, which she and Albert had helped found in 1883. Lizzie and Sarah worked with Lucy on The Alarm, and it helped to organize workers particularly from the garment industry to join their cause. Lucy and Albert were leaders of the Poor People's March in 1884 and led the May 1st, 1886 march of over the 80,000 workers who were demanding an 8-hour day. These protests and publications led to Lucy Parsons being labeled as more dangerous than 1,000 rioters because of her outspoken ways. Just 2 days later, strikers were killed by police at the McCormick Reaper Works. However, it was May 4th, 1886 that would become the most life-altering night of their lives. On this night, Lucy and Lizzie were planning an event called the Sewing Women's Organizing Drive when someone arrived at their meeting, which was being held at the Alarm's office. They requested that Albert Parsons be a speaker at Haymarket Square during a rally that evening. Lucy, Albert, their 2 children, and Lizzie went to Haymarket Square. As the weather deteriorated, the 5 left the gathering and were in a nearby saloon called Zeff's when a dynamite bomb was thrown into a crowd and a riot broke out. Lizzie urged Albert to leave the city that night as she was fearful for his safety. Lucy took their 2 children home, while Lizzie took Albert to the train station and bought his ticket so as to not draw attention. Albert traveled to Geneva, Illinois, and stayed in William and Lizzie's house.
The next day, Lucy and Lizzie traveled to the Alarm office, determined for the next issue to denounce the police atrocity. When they got there, they found that the law enforcement had raided the newspaper office multiple times during the night. By noon, August Spies, Michael Schwab, Adolf Fischer, Gerard Lysius, Oscar Neebe, Chris Spies, Lucy Parsons, Lizzie Holmes, and Maria Schwab were arrested at the office. The police released Lucy in the hopes that she would lead them to Albert, but because she did not comply, the police arrested her twice more that day.
When that bomb was supposedly thrown at the meeting had been dispersed. In other words, the speakers had spoken, they had left, and these were part of the martyrs. They had left. The other part of the martyrs group were not even there. And according to what I understood, what happened and why this happened, nobody really knows.
Sarah Ames was arrested that evening, but only she and Lucy were released, not Lizzie. Lucy set out to inform all of the IWPA groups that the newspapers were suppressed and that many of their members had been arrested and were currently imprisoned. Since Lizzie had been arrested, Albert had to leave the Geneva, Illinois home because he knew it would be searched. His return was set for June 21st, 1886, the first day of the trial. Albert joined with Lucy at Sarah Ames' house before going to court for his surrender. Lizzie Swank Holmes took the witness stand to defend her article, Notice to Tramps.
Look out, you wretched slaves. If, after toiling through your best years, you are suddenly thrown out of a job along with thousands of others, do not start out to hunt for work, for you will strike plenty of such towns as this. You must not walk from town to town. You must not stay where you are in idleness. You must move on. You must not ride. You have no money, and those tracks and cars you helped to build are not for such as you. You must not ask for anything to eat or a place to sleep. You must not lie down and die, for then you would shock people's morals.
On August 20th, the jury found Albert Parsons, August Spies, Oscar Neebe, Michael Schwab, Samuel Fielden, Adolf Fischer, Louis Ling, and George Engel guilty of conspiracy. 7 were sentenced to death, but the 8th, Oscar Neebe, was only sentenced to 15 years in prison.
I'll speak of this. Now, my father-in-law never told my husband or my brother-in-law about their grandfather.
What?
Never spoke. My husband went to Mexico one summer when he was, I think, 14, because his mother, my mother-in-law, had relatives there. And at that time, one of the relatives took my husband to see a mural by Diego Rivera, which depicted the martyrs of the Haymarket. And that's when my husband first learned about his grandfather.
The execution date was set for December 3rd, 1886. Lucy immediately began touring the East Coast to raise awareness and hopefully make enough money for the appeals. Her voice and views reached an estimated 200,000 people in 16 states, and public opinion was drastically shifted in favor of the condemned men.
You may have expected me to belch forth great flames of dynamite and stand before you with bombs in my hands. If you are disappointed, you have only the capitalist press to thank for it.
On Thanksgiving Day, the Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court granted a stay of execution, extending the date of the execution by almost a year. Between November and December, Lucy traveled to St. Louis and Kansas City. She finally gathered enough money to pay for an appeal request. The Illinois Supreme Court denied the appeal for a new trial in September 1887. On November 9, 1887, 2 days before the scheduled execution, Lucy, along with friends and family of the condemned, went to Springfield to beg the governor for clemency for the men. While Governor Oglesby lessened the sentences of Schwab and Fielden to life in prison, the rest of the sentences were unchanged.
Lucy Parsons, Lizzie, and William Holmes traveled to the jail on the night of November 10, 1887, to visit with Albert one last time. They were forbidden to see him, but the sheriff told Lucy she could see him at 8:30 a.m. the next morning. On November 11, 1887, it was cold and icy. Lucy, Lizzie, and Lucy's 2 children went to the jail, but instead of letting them in, the police taunted them, sending them from one corner of the block to the next, promising that someone at the next corner would authorize their entrance. By the time the police refused to let Lucy in, the children were blue with cold and crying. In a desperate attempt to see her husband, she crossed the police line. All 4 of them were immediately arrested and taken to the Chicago Avenue station, where they were stripped and searched for bombs. They were held in cells during the execution, and just after noon, a matron delivered the news that the men were dead. Lizzie and Sarah stayed with Lucy throughout the funeral. An estimated 125,000 people lined the streets of Chicago to pay tribute to the men who had died. In these tough months, Lucy, with the help of Lizzie and William, worked to publish Anarchism, its philosophy and scientific basis by Albert J. Parsons. It appeared in December 1887. The printer delivered 300 copies before it was confiscated by the police.
In the aftermath of the Haymarket Riot, unionization and workers' rights were cast in a negative light, forcing tough compromises. Yet, despite that challenge, Lucy, Lizzie, and Sarah all continued to keep the fight for the workers alive. Sarah Ames' role during the trials and fight for the amnesty of the convicted included a strongly worded refute to the trial judge in an 1893 magazine article. Lizzie Swank Holmes continued her work by helping to form the Ladies Federal Labor Union and the Illinois Women's Alliance. Lucy Parsons joined forces with other labor and rights movements, joining the newly organized Industrial Workers of the World, becoming editor of their paper, The Liberator. The continued efforts of these women and many others carried the story of the martyrs forward, eventually forcing companies to compromise with their workers. This established a tradition of protest and compromise still practiced today.
The Haymarket Riot was a tragic event that resulted in a world-changing compromise. In addition to the blood of the victims, it is crucial to realize that it is also the voices of the women who fought by their side and ensured it was shared worldwide that secured the legacy of their sacrifice that lives on today in the form of the 8-hour workday, as well as the right to protest and demand action for the majority.